So my apologies in advance for the paper rattling. My iPad is messing up today, so I'm back to paper notes. So before we enter the wild world of postmodern architecture, let's run through a quick review of modern architecture. This is Louis Sullivan's Carson Pirie Scott department store. The building employed the new technologies that made skyscrapers possible. Not just steel frames, but also reinforced concrete and elevators. The strength of steel I-beams and reinforced concrete also permitted the large windows and open, flexible interior space, again, important for the building's function as a store. Louis Sullivan's most famous apprentice was Frank Lloyd Wright. Past College Board questions on his work have focused on Wright's efforts to establish an organic relationship between structure and site, on his use of cantilevering, and on his open plans that focused on the hearth as the center of the home. This famous International Style house embodied the International Style slogans. Do you remember? Less is more, form follows function, and buildings should be, quote, machines for living, unquote. This house also used the most up-to-date technology materials, including poured reinforced concrete. Like falling water, it was integrated into its surroundings and had an open floor plan. The Seagram building is in many ways a more typical and famous example of the International Style, which came to be associated with unornamented glass and steel rectangles that speared up into the sky. The Seagram building is actually a little more decorative than many of the high office towers that sprouted up after World War II, thanks to its bronze accents and the plaza that set it back from the street. Still, the basic rectangular glass, concrete, and steel tower became the iconic work of architecture well into the 1970s. So here's another past AP question, very similar to the first one that I showed you. The required works skip over another important aspect of post-war architecture, basically architecture that took on an even sculptural organic form, but still employed new materials such as steel reinforced concrete. Indeed, because concrete was hardened in molds, it actually lent itself to more sculptural design. Stay tuned for Zaha Hadid at the end of this lecture. So this was Frank Lloyd Wright's last work. It's not the Guggenheim that appears on our list of required work. Some of you were confused by that. This is the Guggenheim that some of us just visited in New York City. Like the chapel, this building was designed to be a kind of sculpture. We'll get to the other Guggenheim in just a minute, but first, let's examine the reaction against International Style. We have some more intergenerational rebellion on the way. So this building is not a required work, but you should recognize the architect. He's the same fellow who helped design the Seagram building. The building was, in some ways, Johnson's apology for all those glass and steel towers that he had foisted upon the world. But we still see a lot of International Style elements. There's the simple and unornamented exterior with its streamlined effect. The building's function is largely evident from its exterior. Form, again, follows function. The building retains that basic rectilinear shape, and in general, the design remains highly geometric. So what elements do you see that represent a departure from the International Style? By the way, I could imagine you're getting a similar attribution style question about this building because it kills two art history birds with one stone. So, some thoughts. The building is not a glass box. It is a granite glass structure. Oops, sorry about the dog there. A return to the tradition of using stone for ornamentation and structural support. The building also harks back to history in its decorative effects. So the broken pediment at the top was characteristic of Baroque and neoclassical architecture. I've included an example in the corner. The top also rather whimsically resembles 18th century furniture. You saw this quote, I hope, in your reading. The 1980s and beyond witnessed widespread rebellion against the uniformity and anonymity of those International Style office towers. One criticism leveled against them is that the designs were too generic. They said nothing about the history or culture of the particular community where they were built. In other words, they were too international. National art and identity art had become cool again. Finally, a required work. So what makes this house postmodern? The geometry is more whimsical and it's more varied. Remember, this is the guy who wrote a manifesto entitled Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture and a book entitled Learning from Las Vegas. Venturi himself described this as preferring, quote, messy vitality over obvious unity, unquote. In his design for this house, Venturi referenced earlier historical styles, and he displayed his knack for razzle-dazzle and designs that caught the eye. Venturi pretty clearly rejects form follows function here. That arch, for example, is almost entirely decorative, although it did serve one interesting function. It hid the family bird watchers from the birds they were peering at. And finally, the house reflects the history and traditions of its particular setting. Here's a quote from the architect's own description of the plan. The house sits in rolling fields at the edge of a valley toward the west, with woods toward the north. Traditional in northern Delaware, where the site is located, are 18th century classical barns with generous scale and low horizontal proportions. The walls of these barns are fieldstone with areas of wood frame and siding. We base the form of the house and its symbolism on this kind of indigenous architecture. So here we see that while Venturi borrows from historical styles, the arch and the column, his work is much less imitative than, for example, Renaissance or neoclassical architecture. No Greek temple designer would have gotten away with those flat columns or so freely abandoned symmetry for deliberate asymmetry. Postmodern architects like to mine history for ideas, but they almost never slavishly imitate them. We see a similar whimsy in the house's interior. Postmodern architects are much less afraid of color. So here's another Venturi house, this one designed for his own mother. Again, note the decorative arch and the broken pediment. One last Venturi building. Note the variety of geometric forms and the purely decorative elements. Mies van der Rohe would have hated this. So here's a famous postmodern building that's not on the list but shown up on College Board tests in the past. This architect worked with Philip Johnson on the AT&T Sony building. Again, we see an obvious break with international style. After years of emphasizing the vertical, this design reasserts the horizontal. We see stylized and reinterpreted classical elements such as pilasters, garlands, and keystones. The multiple colors are another postmodernist feature. Again, you might very well have to write an essay on a work you hadn't seen and identify what elements of it are postmodern. And here's another past exam question. The College Board scoring rubric notes that both buildings have playful and extravagant forms, using decoration that is not functional. Opposing form follows function. The design is neither severe nor entirely serious, and both buildings include a whimsical, eclectic mix of historical references, and the architects have resisted a unified environment. Okay, another required work, and this is where we get really weird. Your homework mentioned that the Guggenheim Bilbao was the centerpiece of an urban revitalization project for an aging port city, Bilbao, Spain. It didn't talk about how this setting and history influenced the design, but look at the building. What does it remind you of? How about a ship with a billowing sails, or maybe even a ship that got blown up by a bomb? Bilbao is, after all, the capital of the Basque region of Spain, a region with an active separatist movement where bombs do periodically explode. It's also an industrial city that has lost much of its industry and needed a repurposed downtown. Gehry's museum has proved extraordinarily successful as a draw, so popular that efforts to use culture to revitalize cities are now sometimes called Bilbao effect. This aerial view gives you a better sense of how the museum was anchored to the riverfront, which is now a vast park complex. Gehry is also the most famous deconstructivist architect, although interestingly he rejects the term. But everybody else seems to think he's a deconstructivist, so let's talk about what that means. Here is the building that thrust Frank Gehry into the limelight. It started off as a generic Dutch-roofed suburban house, and it morphed into this weird collection of industrial materials: chain-link fence, plywood, galvanized zinc, cinder block, and exposed wood framing, all arranged into lopsided cubes. I do wonder what the neighbors thought. Anyway, this is how Wikipedia defines deconstructivism. I thought it was pretty clear. It's characterized by fragmentation, an interest in manipulating a structure's surface and skin, non-rectilinear shapes that appear to distort and dislocate traditional elements of architectural structure. In other words, unpredictable unpredictability, and controlled chaos rule. But it's very controlled chaos. One of my favorite quotes is, "To err as human, to really foul up requires a computer. To really deconstruct, at least buildings that aren't going to fall down, even if it looks like they're about to, also requires a computer." These twisting curves are extremely complex mathematically. They were designed using a 3D design software called CADIA, which allows architects to create complex designs and make calculations that would not have been possible even a few years ago. Essentially, the software digitizes points on the edges, surfaces, and intersections of Gehry's hand-built models to construct on-screen models that can then be manipulated in the manner of animated cartoons. The building's walls and ceilings are load-bearing, containing an internal structure of metal rods that forms grids with triangles. CADIA again calculates the number of bars required in each location, as well as the bars' positions and orientations. The walls and ceilings have several insulating layers and a thin outer coating of titanium. Why titanium? Okay, this is where I really start geeking out. I found a National Geographic engineering video that answers that question. Here's our last required image from the work. It demonstrates how carefully the building was designed to suit its riverside site and the industrial surroundings that it both echoed and transformed. So I'm going to show you 3 other Frank Gehry deconstructivist buildings, all very distinctive. I'm struck that most of these deconstructive buildings are either cultural centers or university buildings. In other words, they're works designed for patrons who might be more tolerant of experimental designs and maybe patrons whose functional demands are more flexible. It's hard to see any of these functioning as an office building. Our final architectural work is also a museum designed by Iraqi-born British architect Zaha Hadid. She died quite recently in 2016, and her obituaries repeatedly noted that she is one of the most famed female architects, indeed most acclaimed architects working in the 21st century. The building is a museum of contemporary art. Its companion museum features 21st century architecture. Since we've raced through the 20th and 21st century architecture today, let me ask, where would you place this work? It's not international style glass, steel, and metal box, but neither is it quite as deconstructed as Gehry's Bilbao Museum. The columns and overhang remind me somewhat of the Villa Savoy, and the material, once again, is molded concrete. On the other hand, the architect is clearly playing with geometry in an innovative and maybe slightly disruptive deconstructivist way. She has also, like Gehry, sought to integrate her design into its urban setting. Architecture Today commented that, quote, "A pedestrian walkway follows the outline of the building, restoring an urban link that had been blocked for almost a century by the military barracks that previously occupied this site." Hadid acknowledged that she was strongly influenced by Russian revolutionary art and architecture. The geometric suprematist paintings of Kazimir Malevich and constructivist architecture. On the right, you see a famous example of constructivist architecture from a period when Soviet leaders were still encouraging artistic experimentation. It's a little hard to see this from the required images, but this virtual plan makes the design clearer. Basically, the building is composed of bending oblong tubes that overlap and intersect, almost like a cloverleaf on an interstate highway. The curved side walls are made of concrete, with internal stairways of black painted steel. So let's watch a video made by Zaha Hadid's architectural firm, which includes the architect's explanation of what she was hoping to accomplish. Think about whether she succeeded, whether this form will indeed suit the function of a multi-purpose, multicultural art centers. Here are a couple more Zaha Hadid buildings. Note that both the highly geometric and irregular, less whimsical than postmodern architecture shapes, but maybe not quite as deconstructed as Frank Gehry's works. On to the equally wild world of video art.